Today on the Hobby Bench, I'll be talking about 5 Leagues from the Borderlands from Modiphius Games. So, 5 Leagues from the Borderlands is a solo fantasy skirmish game. And you have this warband that's sort of exploring this region, exploring this small section of this fantasy world, trying to take the fight against these encroaching threats on that. So it really does have a little bit of a RPG light type of feel for it. It encompasses a larger campaign. Now, I guess a little bit of history about 5 Leagues from the Borderlands itself. It sort of branched off from the 5-core skirmish system. And, that sort of branched off into a World War game called 5 Men from Kursk. And part of that also was 5 Leagues in the Borderlands. So this has sort of been floating around for a little bit in Wargaming Vault. And you can find some earlier versions of that rules. But, finally Modiphius sort of picked it up and worked on first, 5 Parsecs from Home, which was like a sci-fi skirmish game, sort of in the same vein of these other games they had. And following it up, then they came out with a 3rd edition of 5 Leagues from the Borderlands. Now, I find it sort of interesting, this game, because as the RPG elements go, to me it's sort of similar to an old Solar War game, Barbarian Prince. And there you were this disposed prince that had a certain amount of time to basically get, I think, about 500 gold or so. And so you explore this region, it's a hex crawl. You go into one hex, sort of encounter and see what's going on. Maybe you fight, maybe you pick up a sympathetic nobleman that might, give some silver to your cause. You can get some followers, you can explore some ruins. And a large aspect of the game, of course, was to have so much food and so many supplies and so much gold and keep track of those resources as you progress on through. And I think a little bit in that aspect that's sort of ported over into this game here from 5 Leagues in the Borderlands, because you have this warband of a few heroes and a couple of followers, 6 characters in total, typically. And so you have to sort of manage your income to make sure you can pay off your followers and pay your heroes and sort of keep them happy, have enough food. If there's anybody that's wounded, then make sure you give them some time to heal up. So in general, that's one aspect of that, is that managing that warband and making sure that you've got enough resources to keep everybody happy and healthy and fed. And then, of course, you have this other aspect where you're going through and sort of exploring this region and having encounters with these creatures and monsters to fight them out and basically get lots of treasure and get these adventure points that you use for trying to end the campaign. So one aspect I'll say maybe a little bit later on, I can talk about probably 5 Leagues of Borderlands compared to 5 Parsecs from Home. Some of the differences is, one of them is that you will have this definite region. Now, I just picked up a much more detailed map from Dyson Logos. I love the stuff that he does. He has some great RPG maps. And I picked up something here that was more of a hex crawl, classic wilderness map. But, the author really encourages you to start with a blank canvas and throw in a couple of features, maybe a lake or a couple of mountainous hills and that kind of thing. Very sparse in details. And when you create the world itself, you're going to have maybe a city or a couple of villages. You're going to sort of sketch out an area, and then you'll say, well, there might be some ruins here, or possibly a hidden camp. And a large area of this actually is going to be unexplored. And basically, you'll just be moving your group through in an abstract way of travel. Usually it's from one location to another location. There's not, irrespective of distance, actually on the map itself. You can see that's part of the journey that you do. And sort of, explore this area and just try to figure out, what are these outcoming threats that are coming in there, and where are they hidden away their base camps, and sort of take the fight to them. So when you create out the game itself and you start out the campaign, you're going to have various amounts of foes. There's really going to be 3 groups that you're fighting against, and they'll be at some varying strengths, but typically you have one that's probably the main threat of the region, and then a couple other secondary threats. And these can have quite a bit of variety from them. They can be like a rattling or a skaven horde. You can have marauding groups of maybe orcs or goblins, undead. They have what they call the Ice Heart Court, which is basically this Fey or Elven opposition, but there may be these high elves that are a little bit more cold-based. And you could even have, let's say, roving bands of brigands. I also like the aspect, too, that you've got maybe the encroaching war that's coming in. So you might have this encroaching army, or could have barbarians that are coming in and, striving to cause chaos in the land. So you're just sort of taking a fight against them. you're going to create your region initially. You'll have some sparse locations that you'll list out. And then you'll also establish, what are you fighting against? What are these type of foes? And they're just going to have like a general flavor of some of the creatures and some of the things that you're going to fight against. And even within those, there's going to be quite a bit of variability. So you're creating up your warband. It'll be 4 heroes, and then you'll typically have 2 followers that have the opportunity to sort of progress themselves and become heroes themselves. And these characters that you have encompass some very basic statistics. You have like a combat skill. You're going to have, like, say, how tough they are, maybe a little bit of willpower, how they might be able to overcome some adversity, bare bones type stats. It's not a full list of different abilities or that sort. It's very sparse with that. In addition to that, you're going to have a choice of different skills. And these skills aren't layered on, so you can't have multiple skills of the same type. It's really going to be the more skills that you have, the broader type of things that you can do. And this provide a simple bonus to a roll that you make. And a lot of rolls that you make are be on 6-sided dice or 2 6-sided dice. And that's sort of what you'll use for a lot of the things that you're working with. Now, of your warband itself, you're going to have one individual of this that you're going to call your avatar. They're going to have a little bit of plot armor for the most part. But, and they'll never, of course, be dissatisfied with your warband and leaving that sort. So you'll always sort of have them around. But it is a possibility they can get wiped out. And you sort of have to try to keep the campaign going as you can. Amongst the characters, too, that you have, most of them are going to be human. You have a couple race options. You have like Fey Blood, sort of like an elvish type. You have Dusklings. They don't really define those, but those are more like, I think, like a orc type characters or some really barbarian type characters. You even have what they call preen, which are these avian bird type characters. Halflings, of course, are a choice that you've got there too. And you've got also these, feral type of creatures, which would be like more like these beastmen type. And so you have a couple of choices there. It's interesting that you don't have dwarves, which I'm surprised by that. But you know what? I do know that dwarves are in another expansion for this game. So you're going to generate your heroes. You'll have basically some chance of increasing some of their skills or their abilities, maybe increasing their combat skill or increasing their toughness. And you're going to have a bare bones amount of gear for them. Maybe certain armor types and certain weapons. And of course, maybe potentially a couple of skills. In addition to this too, you have a choice of getting a mystic character too. And so there's a little bit of magic in this one, but I want to say the magic is more of an enhancement kind of magic. You might provide some buffs for your characters or from healing, or maybe slightly impede their enemy. You're not going to find a lot of really super powerful spells like lightning bolts and that kind of thing. There's a little bit of some trappings in there for the most part, but it's much more subtle type magic. I think a great way of probably capturing that is the Name of the Wind series and how they do magic in there. That's sort of like a similar type of thing here. You'll have a limit of some spells that you'll have prepared, and so they're not really overbearing. So you can have a mystic, and you can sort of broach a little bit into that type of play a little. But I want to say this, it's not going to completely throw the game out of complete whack and out of complete balance. They're not going to be these super powerful wizards. It's more of some subtle effects that they do on the battlefield. So the campaign itself, you're going to have your warband, you're going to have a certain amount of resources. You're going to sort of spend the campaign out initially just sort of planning out what you're going to do for just your maintenance. So you got to make sure, checking, do you have enough food? Do you have enough money for your warband, that kind of thing. And then you're going to take choice. You can have your different characters in your warband do different activities. And it depends on where you're at. So you can be more of a civilized setting, or even for a remote setting like at camp. And you can spend that time there. What you're going to say is that I'm just going to spend most of this initial time either in camp or in town, trying to get resupply or do some hunting and fishing, and maybe, gather up some resources that make bandages, that kind of thing, or heal up. And so you'll assign different tasks for your different characters, and they'll just do some certain things. And at that point too, then you're going to start to spend out, what you're going to do during as more of the adventure phase. And sometimes this can be rather basic. You can just say, look, I'm not going to really go out in the wilderness. I'm going to maybe spend some time around town, or maybe do some patrols along the roads, that kind of thing. Help out the town guard. Slowly, for sure get a little bit of gold, doing this kind of thing. Or, like likewise in the woods, you can say, look, I'm going to spend a lot more time just trying to, clear out the area and, just sort of see what type of ruckus I can get into. Now, if you're making out traveling and doing that, then you're actually going someplace, you're going to roll on a travel table to sort of see what you sort of encounter. Maybe you'll encounter some individuals that might give you some quests or, provide you some clues of what's sort of going on. And this can be the same thing in town too, that you'll have some type of activity some type of random event that'll happen that can sort of maybe be a boon or a bust to your character. And after you do this, then you're going to go ahead and sort of branch out and figure out, what am I going to go after? What am I trying to do? Am I going to explore this delve, or I'm going to try to find an encampment and go after that? And so after this travel roll, and after you sort of see what sort of happens on the road, then you can have an actual proper adventure. And for those, you're going to have certain type of encounters. And they have all sorts of randomized tables for things that you'll go across. But then you'll have certain scenarios, and these are actually a little bit more structured. So you can have, let's say, a pitched battle that's more of a neutral type battle that you can have. You can go into an encampment and sort of raid an encampment. And there can be a little bit more of a hideout raid where you have a little bit more of aggressive defense and you're like attacking a certain point, fighting against them. So there's some variety of scenarios. And they include these also like maybe dungeon delves. And so they can say, look, you're going to have a random assortment of rooms and some corridors and stuff like that in some certain areas. And you've got to go through and explore those areas and just sort of see, what you can find and try to get enough information to decide, okay, are we set with that? Or do we want to, continue further? Maybe it's a good time to go back. You got enough information in this area, and then you can sort of decide, should I press on further a little bit later on, or maybe just sort of, cut our losses and say, this is just too dangerous, don't want to go forward anymore. And that's the thing about delves is that it is something that you can progress through, and it can go by levels, and they sort of encourage you really to revisit the same delve and go deeper and deeper into these type of dungeons. Now, you can even have, say, monster lairs where you go after certain creatures like minotaurs or hydras or whatever, and beat those monsters. And the idea is once you're take a fight against one of these threats, you're going to get adventure points. When you're setting this up, you're going to have randomized enemies, and they'll just have some basic stats again that they have, their armor and their toughness and sort of, how quickly they move. And they might have some special rules for how they work in combat and, sort of dictate their behavior with that. But there's a very simple AI that you'll have for your figures. Usually your ranged enemies will attack first. And then if you have your enemies that are armed with melee weapons, well, they're going to go to the nearest hero and attack them. And there's some basic manners of AI. It's a little bit more freeform. The author really sort of encourages you, just try to go ahead through and, use common sense for a lot of these things and, gang up when you can. And there is definitely a morale system that goes on. So as they're taking casualties, or most types will run and just basically run the field. And so then you can say the encounter's over, that you've, taken the field for the day. Of course, they can have some small enemies that, they'll never run. They, they're bolstered by a leader type. So, they'll just stay into the fight. And, that's how that'll sort of work through. You'll play out that scenario and, either you'll have to decide that, hopefully do is cut and run. And, then you'll roll on a table to see if you escape okay, or if you're severely wounded, or if maybe somebody's cut down as you're running. Or if you win, then you'll have, loot and things that you can roll on the table, on various tables to, see what you find. And including this also can be some potential clues. And lastly, what you're really striving to do is get adventure points. As you accrue a certain amount of adventure points, you can get a chance to reduce the threat of that foe that is attacking the region that you have. And What I want to mention is that really what you're going to do is that you're going to roll a die and it'll be less than the number of adventure points that you spend. So, you want to accrue quite a bit to make this chance of reducing that threat. So if you have 3 adventure points, you just got to roll a d6 and get 3 or less. So it's not a done deal when you're doing this to, reduce that threat. Lastly, you can't reduce a threat completely until you basically find an encampment and then raid that encampment and destroying that actual camp. And that's what's sort of fun, is that you're going to find areas out there that are there's these different encampments that represent the different threats, and they're hidden, and you don't know where they are. And so you have to explore out the region and slowly get more information, and you'll get a chance to find a hidden encampment, and then you can make a choice, am I going to go in and raid it and just try to beat off these creatures? And eventually, if you can find the encampments and get rid of them, then you can have a chance of actually reducing it to 0 and getting rid of it completely. Now I want to talk about the combat a little bit, and I love that they have a quick reference sheet in this. And so the idea there is you can take a limited number of actions. Basically, you can take one combat action, you can take a move, or you can do an all-out move, or you can do a move and some sort of other generic action, like doing a search or operating a winch or something like that, depending on the type of scenario that you have. So, commonly you'll have, let's say, a move and, 1 round of combat. You engage somebody and fight that individual. So in combat, it's going to go through a series of rounds. Initially, what we're going to do is going to sort of establish your order for who attacks first. And you're going to be rolling d6s for all your heroes in your warband, and you're trying to get a low score. And so it's these series of rounds of who attacks first, the quick reaction first, that's initial phase. Then you'll have your opposition do their attacks. And then finally, there'll be the last phase where the heroes will then take their actions if they didn't act beforehand. In these phases, as they go through, some conditions won't carry through. So if you're stunned, let's say, initially in a ranged attack, from a quick reaction, like somebody actually was able to get off a quick shot from a bow, if they're stunned there in that case, once you move on to the next phase, the creatures are acting, that stun is removed so that they can act normally. For melee combat, it's a little bit more engaged. And for those, I like to maybe use some different markers to indicate who's attacking and who's defending. And so you're going to have 3 rounds when you actually do a fight. So when you activate a creature, and if it's in base-to-base combat, or if it moves into base-to-base with a figure, you're going to have a melee exchange. There's going to be 3 different exchanges. So basically, you're going to roll off simultaneously, and whoever rolls the higher combat skills, wins that round. And it depends on what happens if you're the attacker or the defender. If you're the defender and you win off that round, then it switches places, and then you become the attacker. If it's a tie and an actual draw, you're rolling a d6 and you're adding your combat skill, then basically combat ends completely. So it's a little interesting in that, of how the fights go. It's a little bit more cinematic than maybe like 5 Parsecs from Home, where you might just have 1 attack. Here you're going through 3 different rounds. Now, if you're an attacker and you beat the combat skill of your defender, then you have a potential to have a chance to do damage against them. So talk about combats and a little bit more on some of the outcomes. Again, if you roll over the toughness, then they're eliminated outright. But if you roll, equal to their toughness or less, they'll be stunned and they'll be wounded. If you get 2 wounds, you're out of the fight. And as I mentioned too about stunned, is that, that imparts a opportunity for your opponent to have a higher combat skill and be able to easier to hit you, but there's no real lasting effect aside from that. And as I mentioned, it's interesting with the exchanges that, you need to get multiple stun results for it to actually retain throughout that phase. But, once all the monsters, let's say, attack, if your guy's stunned at that point, they're going to recover no matter what and be able to act normally during their phase. So the bookkeeping is, rather limited, and I appreciate that. Range combat, pretty simple. You're going to basically roll a hit, then you'll roll over their toughness, see if they have any armor, they get an armor save, and then if you inflict a hit that gets through all of that, rolling a d6, for certain values, then you're pretty much going to wipe out the opposition. Combat itself is a little interesting. You do have some options, like you can fight defensively, There's some positioning. If you have higher ground, you have what's called a special counterattack ability. So if you're attacked, you can immediately make another attack back. And there's some type of weapons that allow you to do that too. So there's some granularity there in the type of weapons. And I like that, some different tactical options that you can choose in fighting. If your mystic gets in a fight, and you're armed with a staff, well, that gives you a chance to have a little bit higher defensive score and parry off a little bit more. And you can say, look, I'm just going to fight defensively. So I'm going to get a bonus. And then, if I win, then I can just basically get out of combat. And so you have those type of options. Or you can fight furiously and say, look, I'm going to add more chances to roll over your toughness and, be able to hit you. But of course, then I'm leaving myself open to being attacked itself. And so there's some neat little options that you have for that. I appreciate that. Now, I guess to think about the game and some overall aspects of that, I sort of held off for a while in playing it because, you require, I want to say probably about 8 to 10 different miniatures that will represent your opposition. And so I like that aspect there. It's a little bit random of, who you'll fight against and the makeup of those. And I want to say with this too is that you have a chance of, in addition to the group that you're fighting of these certain monsters, you're going to have also a chance to have some champions or some mystics and those kind of things, a captain of some sort that also can be incorporated with the opposition that you're playing against. And that's pretty neat with that. But I enjoy this aspect. You've got a fair amount of variety of different creatures. And it's sort of fun too that, they just have tables upon tables upon tables of things that can just happen. And so for preparation in the very beginning, you're going to have some town events. You can have a gambling craze, or there's a market day, or a wandering healer. I'm going to say a lot of times it skews to maybe things that sort of get you a little bit. Like there could be pickpockets that, actually steal out some gold from you or steal some equipment. And, you're sort of screwed there. But I appreciate that it's just sort of very fun. And that aspect, as I mentioned, to me, it reminds me a little bit of Barbarian Prince that, you make these different choices. This is sort of what I'm going to go and this is what I'm going to do. And then, as you're traveling, you're just going to randomly come across somebody. And it can leave these little breadcrumbs of a larger quest. And so you get these choices like, what are you going to do? Who are you going to go after? I've worked in this region here. I've done the groundwork. I sort of think I have this hidden encampment. I think I have a chance of maybe sort of discovering that. So I'm going to really go after that. Or I can say there's a dungeon, and then, hey, I want to really go check out that dungeon and maybe I can get lucky and get some magic items and some better gear to sort of help bolster up my group. So I'll be better prepared when I actually take on raiding an encampment and, taking the fight to the creatures. And that's what I appreciate about this game. And that's sort of the fun thing about that. You've got these characters and you're going to slowly get, more loot and more equipment and increase their abilities and be able to do some type of progression. And that's a really fun aspect of the game itself. And you sort of have a little bit of bookkeeping. And you want to try to manage a little bit of resources, and that's sort of fun with that aspect some. And, just trying to make sure that your warband's healthy enough that you can just, again, go on these adventures and try to basically score out adventure points and just try to reduce the threat of the region itself. And that's a fun balancing act a little bit with there. And sometimes it can be frustrating. You can just get absolutely horrible die rolls. That can be mitigated some. It's some luck as a reward. You can do some re-rolls and try to get through that. And I find sometimes, you're going to have a couple of campaign turns. You're just trying to manage everything. You're just trying to make sure you've got enough money coming in. And that's sort of a neat aspect of that. It's not always just encounter after encounter after encounter. You've got to sort of manage your resources a little bit and prepare to actually go out into the wilderness or, go into that monster's lair and fight against this creature and then expect to do I have enough resources afterwards to sort of recover and recoup my losses. And I want to say too, the combat is brutal. Hopefully you don't lose that round of combat. They don't go over your toughness. Then you have armor. And again, with armor, basically there's going to be like a 1 in 3 chance that you can basically shrug it off and just ignore it. And that's like maybe a more heavier armor type. So really there's a good chance that you're going to get whacked, and you're going to have your followers, and you probably have some heroes that get really wounded or die outright. And that's going to just be this ever churning roster sometimes of some of the guys that you have. And it can be agonizing to have some guy that you've carried through the entire time and they just get stomped on by a troll, and it just happens. So I think maybe that's one negative thing I'll say a little bit about 5 Leagues is that combat is so fast and brutal. You can spend all this time maybe getting this battlefield set up, all this different terrain and stuff like that, and this looks great. And then you have a combat that just be over real quick. And then, okay, well, I've got to take everything down and set up another one and set up another one. And so that can be a little bit of a churn sometimes in doing that. I'm going to mention too, out of the book, that the levels of threat that you have, and it's such a slow amount of adventure points that you accrue to actually try to reduce them. I play sort of the house rule of probably lowering those down quite a bit. This is going to be a long campaign. If you play it, rules as written, it's going to take some time to get through, which is good, because you don't want something you can just crap through real quick. But I do recommend is just, maybe just taking those ideas and just sort of trimming down those threat levels a little bit. They maybe just give you a little bit more of a game that you can go through and complete out. It's funny, I've had the gumption to get these campaigns going, but I still don't think I've ever finished out one because it's just this insurmountable amount of threat that you can have for a lot of these guys. And it can take so much time to get through and get a chance to sort of reduce them down and get rid of those threats and wipe the land clean of all the evil. It just really does take some time. So that can be a little bit of a detraction. But overall, I want to say, 5 Leagues, I think, is great. It's a wonderful skirmish war game. I love that it's got these little trappings of role-playing in it and encompasses this larger campaign. And it really encourages you to sort of get a story that happens through your choices that you make. Do I go into this dungeon here and what do I find? And the outcomes of those, you'll possibly find some great loot, or maybe half your party gets wiped out and then you got to sort of recover from that. And it's this evolving story that happens without it. And I think that's what sort of makes this game work. Because the combat itself is pretty cut and dried. There are some tactical elements in there for the melee, which I enjoy. There's some positioning and trying to use terrain and cover, that kind of thing. But for the most part, it's pretty simple. And I think what makes this work is all the things that can happen afterwards and the things that you can do beforehand. And even the idea of the opposite you play, that, it's a bunch of random rolls, going against a certain type of threat. And they'll encompass maybe a certain flavor of those type of creatures, but, there'll be some variation with that. And that's sort of fun with those things. But, overall, I want to say those are the elements, I think, of the campaign itself that really makes it stand out. And, I guess the detraction is that you need to have, I would say, don't kill yourself trying to get all the type of creatures you have, because you have quite a variety of monsters that you'll fight against and enemies. And so I recommend maybe getting some Pathfinder pawns or something of that sort to sort of supplement maybe some of the painted figures that you have, because you just may not have enough of a certain type. Or look, I don't want to have a crossbow beastman, or I don't have some ranged beastmen. I don't have anything a model like that. So you could say, well, I've got some odd guys out. That's what I'll say, that, they're the ones with some ranged weapons. You just sort of let go with that. I envy people that have those type of collections that can just encompass everything. And, I've got a lot of bones and it's pretty good, but to the letter to be able to field exactly what I have on the table, sometimes that can be a challenge. So I recommend is, maybe just try to get some generic soldiers, or you can always use proxies, but, maybe something that can sort of stand out, some cheap options to really encourage you to say, look, I'll jump into the game. I may not have all the figures, but I've got enough generic tokens to supplement my force. And of course, as you get casualties, you can swap those out and, get a little bit more of a engaging experience on the table and what you're fighting. So I like it. I enjoy it. This has an enchanting war game in here that tells a story. And you've got this small, scrappy warband of heroes just trying to find out all these threats that are going against this region that's your homeland and taking them on and getting rid of them and taking the fight to your enemy and vanquishing them and being triumphant. And that aspect there, I do enjoy that quite a bit. And I think that, 5 Leagues really does capture that. So if you want this type of skirmish war game, a solo war game that encompasses this larger overarching campaign that has, these little trappings of, RPG stuff in it, definitely check out 5 Leagues from the Borderlands. I think that you'll find it pretty engaging, a lot of fun. Definitely something to check out on the tabletop.